A $300 million deal was dying on the 47th floor of Hawthorne Global. 12 interpreters hired from the top firms in the country sat defeated, none of them able to keep up with the rapid-fire blend of rare dialects the Cronin Consortium kept throwing across the table. Vivian Hart, CEO, already had her hand on the folder ready to walk. Then a man in a gray janitor's uniform, still gripping his mop cart, stepped forward from the hallway and asked for 30 seconds. He spoke the first language, then the second, then the eighth. The room went dead silent. 7 days before that moment in the glass conference room, Caleb Monroe pushed his mop cart through the empty halls of Hawthorne Global's headquarters at 2 in the morning. The building was a cathedral of steel and silence. At that hour, 49 floors of polished marble ambient lighting on automatic timers, and the faint hum of server rooms buried somewhere deep in the walls. Caleb knew every corner of it. He knew which elevator made a clicking sound on the 32nd floor, which bathroom faucet on 18 leaked no matter how many times maintenance filed a report, and which stairwell door on 47 never locked properly. He had been cleaning this building for 3 years, 5 nights a week, and in all that time, not a single executive had ever learned his name. That was by design. Caleb lived a life built on invisibility. 33 years old, lean quiet, with the kind of face people looked through rather than at. He rented a studio apartment 14 blocks from the Hawthorne Tower, a place so small the kitchen counter doubled as a desk, and the closet held exactly 4 sets of clothes. His paychecks went to rent food and the remaining balance of a medical debt that had followed him for years like a slow-moving storm. There was nothing extra. No streaming subscriptions, no car, no credit cards. Just work, sleep, and the small transistor radio he kept on the nightstand, tuned to foreign language stations that drifted in and out of signal depending on the weather. The radio was the one thing that didn't make sense if you looked at Caleb's life from the outside. So was the cardboard box under his bed, stuffed with battered phrasebooks, grammar guides with cracked spines, and notebooks filled with handwriting so dense the margins had run out of space years ago. French, German, Spanish, Italian, Japanese, Arabic, Russian, Mandarin. 8 languages he had taught himself across a decade of restless, stubborn repetition, picking up work in whatever country would have him learning from the people who labored beside him. Every job temporary. Every country a classroom he couldn't afford, but attended anyway. He never talked about it. Not to anyone at Hawthorne, not to the other night shift janitors, not to the landlord, who sometimes asked why he was always mumbling to himself in languages that weren't English. Caleb had learned a long time ago that people didn't want to know what a janitor thought, or what he could do. They wanted the floors clean and the trash emptied by morning. Anything beyond that made them uncomfortable. On the 47th floor, things had been different all week. Caleb noticed it on Monday. Extra security badges, catering orders he'd never seen before, and a tension in the daytime staff that lingered in the air like static even after they'd gone home. By Wednesday, the whispers had filtered down to the maintenance crew. Hawthorne Global was about to close the biggest deal in its history, a partnership with something called the Cronin Consortium, a multinational group with operations across Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia. The number being thrown around was $300 million, though nobody on the cleaning staff knew if that was real or just building mythology. What Caleb did know, because he cleaned the conference room where the prep meetings happened, was that Vivian Hart was running the negotiation personally. He had seen her name on every whiteboard agenda, every printed brief left behind on the table. Vivian Hart, CEO of Hawthorne Global, since she was 34, the youngest in the company's history, and by every account, the most demanding. Caleb had never spoken to her. He had seen her exactly 3 times, always late at night, when she was still in her office on the 49th floor, the light cutting a sharp rectangle into the darkened hallway. She never looked up. He never stopped pushing his cart. The Cronin Consortium, from what Caleb could piece together, through discarded briefing documents, had a reputation that preceded them, like a warning. They were known across the global business world for their unconventional negotiation tactics, not because they were dishonest, but because they believed that any company worth partnering with should be able to handle pressure that went beyond spreadsheets and projections. Their philosophy was simple and ruthless. If you couldn't adapt to the unexpected, you had no business signing a contract that would span continents. Past partners had described their negotiation style as a stress test designed to reveal whether the people sitting across the table were genuinely competent or merely well-rehearsed. By Thursday, Hawthorne's preparation hit full speed. Vivian assembled what her chief of staff called the best linguistic team money can buy. 12 interpreters sourced from 5 different agencies, covering 9 languages between them. They were credentialed, vetted, and expensive. Each one had handled high-level corporate or diplomatic translation before. On paper, there was no gap in coverage. Caleb saw their files scattered across the conference table that night while he vacuumed the carpet. Impressive resumes, elite universities, government clearances. He put the papers back exactly where he found them and moved on to the next room. Friday morning arrived with the weight of something inevitable. The conference room on 47 had been transformed a long obsidian table surrounded by 24 leather chairs. Water glasses aligned with military precision and floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the city skyline like a painting no one had time to admire. Vivian Hart walked in at 8:45, 15 minutes before the Cronin delegation was scheduled to arrive. She wore a charcoal suit and no jewelry except a watch. Her expression carried the particular stillness of someone who had already rehearsed every possible outcome and decided that failure was not among them. The Cronin delegation entered at 9 sharp 6 representatives, led by a tall man with silver-gray hair and a handshake that lasted exactly 1 second. Caleb wasn't in the room then. He was finishing his overnight shift, collecting trash bags from the 46th floor, running behind schedule, because a pipe had leaked in the East Wing restroom. His shift was supposed to end at 7, but the leak cost him 90 minutes, and now he was pushing his cart past the 47th floor hallway, just as the meeting began behind closed doors. He should have kept walking. That was the protocol. Night maintenance staff were not permitted on executive floors during business hours without prior clearance. Caleb knew the rule. He had never broken it. But the stairwell door on 47, the one that never locked properly, was propped open, and the conference room's secondary entrance, normally sealed, had been left ajar by a catering assistant who delivered coffee 10 minutes earlier and forgot to pull it shut. Through that narrow gap, sound traveled clearly. At first it was just background noise, formal greetings, the scraping of chairs. Then Caleb heard the shift. The lead Cronin representative began speaking in French mid-sentence, and then switched without warning to a regional German dialect that Caleb recognized instantly as Swabian. One of the 12 interpreters attempted to follow, stumbled over a verb conjugation, and asked the speaker to repeat. The Cronin representative smiled and switched to rapid Castilian Spanish. Not textbook Spanish, but the clipped idiomatic version spoken in northern Spain, loaded with slang that most classroom-trained translators would miss entirely. Caleb stopped pushing his cart. He stood in the hallway, one hand on the mop handle, and listened. Through the gap in the door, he could see the interpreters cycling through attempts one would start translating, lose the thread, and defer to another. The Cronin team kept shifting Italian with Milanese inflections, then formal Japanese, then a passage in Arabic that mixed modern standard with colloquial Egyptian phrasing. It wasn't random. Caleb could hear the pattern. Each switch was calculated to expose the gap between textbook fluency and real comprehension. And buried inside the rapid transitions so smoothly embedded that a distracted listener would miss it entirely were specific legal phrases. Contract terminology. Liability clauses disguised as pleasantries. Caleb felt his chest tighten. He recognized what was happening because he had lived inside these languages, not studied them from a distance. The Cronin team wasn't just testing Hawthorne's interpreters. They were inserting conditional language into what sounded like casual negotiation phrases that, if translated loosely or incorrectly, would lock Hawthorne into terms far less favorable than what appeared on the written contract. None of the 12 interpreters caught the buried meanings. Caleb heard them translating surface-level compliments, while the real implications slid past unchallenged. He stood there for a long time, long enough to hear Vivian Hart's voice cut through the noise, sharp and controlled, asking her lead interpreter for a precise translation of the last 3 exchanges. The interpreter hesitated, then offered a version that was technically accurate on the surface, but missed every buried implication. Vivian accepted it. She had no reason not to. She trusted the experts she'd hired. Caleb looked down at his mop cart. He looked at the gray uniform he'd worn for 3 years, stained at the cuffs from bleach and floor cleaner. He thought about his rent due in 9 days. He thought about the medical debt that still showed up on every statement. He thought about what happens to a janitor who walks into a $300 million negotiation and tells a room full of executives that their entire translation team is wrong. Then he heard the Cronin lead representative deliver another phrase, this time in Russian, spoken quickly, almost offhandedly, that referenced a non-compete clause so aggressive it would effectively prevent Hawthorne from operating in 3 European markets for 5 years. The interpreter assigned to Russian translated it as a mutual commitment to regional cooperation. Caleb let go of the mop cart. He straightened his uniform. He walked to the secondary entrance, placed one hand flat against the door, and pushed it open. Every head in the room turned. More than 20 people in tailored suits stared at a man in a janitor's uniform who had no appointment, no clearance, no badge, and absolutely no business being there. Caleb met Vivian Hart's eyes, cold, unreadable, already measuring him, and said the only thing he could think of that might buy him more than 5 seconds before security dragged him out. "Ma'am, I can give you 30 seconds. That's all I need. And if I'm wrong, I'll walk out, and you'll never see me again." The room did not react the way people do in stories. There was no gasp, no dramatic silence followed by whispered intrigue. What happened was simpler and more brutal. Vivian Hart looked at Caleb Monroe the way someone looks at a crack in a windshield, an interruption that needs to be dealt with before it spreads. Her chief of staff, a sharp-jawed man named Douglas Perry, was already on his feet, one hand raised toward the security officer stationed near the main entrance. The 12 interpreters stared at Caleb with expressions ranging from confusion to second-hand embarrassment. And the Cronin delegation, 6 men and women in perfectly fitted European suits, watched with the calm, amused detachment of people who had just been handed proof that their strategy was working. "Get him out," Vivian said. Her voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. Douglas moved toward Caleb immediately, and the security officer unclipped his radio from his belt. Caleb did not step back. He stood just inside the secondary entrance, still in his gray uniform, the bleach-stained cuffs visible under the fluorescent light, and kept his eyes on Vivian. He had expected this. He had expected exactly this, and he had walked in anyway, which meant the only thing that mattered now was whether he could speak before they removed him. The lead Cronin representative, the tall man with silver-gray hair, leaned back in his chair and said something in German to the woman beside him. It was conversational, unhurried, and clearly meant to be overheard. Caleb understood every word. They can't even control their own building. This is who we're supposed to trust with 300 million. The woman responded in French, suggesting they give Hawthorne exactly 10 more minutes before formally withdrawing from the table. The interpreters, still seated, caught fragments, but not the full meaning. None of them translated it for Vivian. Caleb did. Without waiting for permission, without raising his voice, he looked at Vivian and said, "He just told his colleague in German that they can't trust a company that can't control its own building." She answered in French, "They're giving you 10 minutes before they walk." The words landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Vivian's expression shifted not dramatically, but enough. A fraction of a degree. The kind of shift that only happened when new data arrived that didn't fit the existing model. The Cronin lead representative straightened in his chair. His amusement was gone. He studied Caleb with the focused attention of a man recalculating an equation he thought he'd already solved. Vivian looked at Douglas, then at the interpreters, then back at Caleb. The 10-minute clock was real. She could feel the deal sliding off the table, and every credentialed expert she had hired was sitting in silence, unable to stop it. She had spent 4 months preparing for this negotiation. She had reviewed every contingency. She had not prepared for the contingency of needing a janitor. 30 seconds, Vivian said. The words came out flat, stripped of everything except calculation. It was not generosity. It was not trust. It was the arithmetic of a woman who had run out of options and was choosing the least absurd one remaining. Douglas opened his mouth to object, but Vivian cut him off with a look that could have stopped traffic. The security officer stayed where he was, radio still in hand. The room held its breath. Caleb stepped forward. He did not move to the head of the table or try to position himself as an authority. He stood where he was, 3 steps inside the door, and addressed the Cronin delegation directly. He began in French, fluid, Parisian-accented precise, summarizing the last 4 exchanges and identifying the contractual language embedded inside what had sounded like pleasantries. Then he shifted to German, not the textbook Hochdeutsch the interpreters had attempted, but the same Swabian dialect the lead representative had used, repeating key phrases with the correct regional idioms intact. The delegation exchanged glances. Caleb continued. Spanish, Castilian, Northern inflection, fast exposing a liability shift disguised as scheduling language. Italian with the Milanese sharpness the delegation had used, correcting a softened penalty clause. Japanese formal register clarifying a restriction on Pacific operations that had been lost in translation. Arabic shifting between modern standard and the Egyptian colloquial, untangling a passage none of the 12 interpreters had even attempted. Russian direct and unadorned, laying bare the non-compete clause hidden behind regional cooperation. And finally, Mandarin measured and tonally exact, deconstructing a compliment to reveal the penalty structure buried beneath it. It took longer than 30 seconds. No one stopped him. When Caleb finished, the room had changed. Not the furniture, not the lighting, not the skyline visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. What changed was the balance. The Cronin delegation was no longer leaning back. The lead representative's hands were folded on the table in front of him, and he was looking at Caleb the way a chess player looks at the board after an opponent makes a move that wasn't supposed to be possible. The 12 interpreters sat motionless, some of them staring at their own notes, as if searching for where they had gone wrong. Vivian Hart stood at the head of the table with her arms crossed, and for the first time in the negotiation, she was the one who looked like she was in control. She turned back to the Cronin lead and spoke in English, calm and precise. I believe we should revisit the last 6 clauses with full transparency on both sides, unless your team has any objections to proceeding in plain language. The lead representative held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded once. The negotiation resumed, but the dynamic had inverted. Hawthorne was no longer defending. Cronin was recalibrating. Caleb stood by the wall for the remaining 40 minutes of the session, not seated at the table, but not removed from the room either. Vivian did not invite him to sit. She did not thank him. She used him the way a surgeon uses an instrument, precisely without sentiment, and only when the cut required it. Twice more, she directed a question his way, when the interpreters hesitated, and both times Caleb answered with the same quiet accuracy. When the session ended and the Cronin delegation filed out for a scheduled recess, the lead representative stopped beside Caleb at the door. He said nothing. He simply looked at him a long, measuring look, and then walked away. The door closed, and then the room turned on itself. Douglas Perry spoke first. his voice tight with barely contained frustration. "We need to talk about what just happened and how it looks." He wasn't speaking to Caleb. He was speaking to Vivian, but the words were aimed at Caleb the way a thrown stone is aimed at a window. A senior vice president named Martin Cross, who had watched the entire session from the far end of the table, stood up and said what Douglas was too careful to say directly. "We just let a janitor represent this company in front of a $300 million partner. If this gets to the press, if Cronin mentions it in any external communication, we become a punchline. The optics are catastrophic." Two other executives voiced similar concerns. The language was professional, but the meaning was raw. Caleb was a liability. His presence in that room was a breach of protocol, a violation of corporate hierarchy, and a potential embarrassment that needed to be corrected immediately. The recommended correction was simple: terminate his employment, frame it as a policy violation, and ensure he signed a non-disclosure agreement on his way out. Clean, fast, no loose ends. Vivian listened to all of it without expression. She did not defend Caleb. She did not argue. She told Douglas to handle the immediate personnel situation according to standard procedure, and said she would address the broader implications after the recess. Caleb understood what that meant. He had been in enough rooms, kitchens, loading docks, factory floors to recognize the sound of a door closing before it actually shut. What Caleb did not know, as he was escorted back to the service elevator by the security officer, was that the Cronin Consortium had already begun asking questions. Within an hour of the recess, two of their analysts contacted Hawthorne's front office, requesting information about the gentleman who provided linguistic assistance during the morning session. They wanted his name, his background, his qualifications. The inquiries were polite, professional, and carried the unmistakable undertone of recruitment. By early afternoon, a message arrived through an intermediary, not addressed to Hawthorne, but routed through channels that suggested it was meant to reach Caleb directly. The message was brief. Cronin was interested in exploring an independent consulting arrangement, with him separate from any Hawthorne affiliation. The terms were not specified. The implication was, Vivian learned about the Cronin inquiry from Douglas at 4 that afternoon. It complicated everything. A janitor who embarrassed the company was a problem that could be solved with a termination letter. A janitor whom their most important partner was actively trying to recruit was a different kind of problem entirely. One that couldn't be solved by making him disappear, because his disappearance might be exactly what the other side wanted. That evening, the situation escalated beyond Vivian's office. 3 members of the Hawthorne Board of Directors requested an emergency call. The conversation lasted 47 minutes and covered exactly one topic: Vivian's judgment. Martin Cross had briefed the board before the call, framing the incident not as a negotiation success, but as a leadership failure. CEO, who allowed an unvetted, uncleared maintenance worker to participate in the most sensitive meeting in the company's recent history. The board's message was delivered without ambiguity. If Vivian continued to protect or associate with Caleb Monroe in any capacity, they would interpret it as emotional decision-making, and they would initiate a formal review of her position. The vote would not be close. Vivian ended the call and sat alone in her office on the 49th floor, the same office Caleb had seen lit up on late nights as he pushed his cart through the darkened hallway below. She pulled up the contract draft on her screen and stared at the clauses Caleb had identified, the ones her 12 interpreters had missed, the ones that would have cost Hawthorne more than any board member was willing to calculate. 14 blocks away, Caleb sat on the edge of his bed in his studio apartment, holding a single sheet of paper. It was a formal notice of suspension, effective immediately pending an internal review of unauthorized access to a restricted executive session. His key card had already been deactivated. His final paycheck for the current period would be mailed. The letter did not mention languages. It did not mention the negotiation. It mentioned only the violation. Caleb folded the paper twice, set it on the kitchen counter, and looked at the cardboard box under his bed, the one filled with phrase books and grammar guides, and notebooks dense with years of handwriting. 8 languages, a decade of learning, and the only thing it had accomplished today was getting him suspended from the one job that kept him from falling behind on rent. He pulled his work shoes off, set them by the door out of habit, and sat in the silence of the apartment. The transistor radio on the nightstand was off. For the first time in years, he didn't turn it on. Vivian Hart did not sleep that night. She stayed in her office on the 49th floor until well past midnight, not out of indecision, but because she needed to be certain before she moved. The conference room's recording system had captured the entire Friday session audio and video, time-stamped to the second. Vivian pulled the files and played them back from the beginning, this time, with the original Cronin dialogue isolated in one channel and the interpreter's translations in another. She cross-referenced every segment against the written contract draft her legal team had prepared. By the third pass, the picture was undeniable. Caleb had not simply translated better than the hired interpreters. He had identified a pattern of embedded terms that, taken together, would have turned the partnership into a systematic erosion of Hawthorne's international leverage. Vivian ran the projected financial exposure for every clause he had flagged. The total, conservatively estimated, exceeded $90 million over the life of the agreement. She saved the analysis, printed 3 copies, locked them in her desk, and sent a single message to Douglas Perry. Emergency leadership meeting Saturday 9 in the morning, attendance mandatory. Douglas arrived first, followed by Martin Cross and 5 other senior executives, including the 3 board members who had threatened Vivian's position the previous evening. The conference room on 47 still carried the faint residue of Friday's tension, water glasses, not yet cleared chairs slightly askew. Vivian did not wait for small talk. She distributed the printed analysis and gave the room exactly 4 minutes to read it before she spoke. When she did, her voice carried the same flat precision she had used in every negotiation of her career, except now it was directed inward at her own people. She did not re-litigate each clause individually. The document spoke for itself. Instead, she put a single number on the table, 90 million, and let it sit in the room like a weight that no one could lift. Then she asked one question. Which of you would like to explain to our shareholders that we terminated the one person who caught this because his job title made us uncomfortable? No one answered. Martin Cross, who 24 hours earlier had called Caleb's presence catastrophic optics, stared at the analysis with the expression of a man realizing he had almost walked off a cliff in the dark. One of the board members cleared his throat and asked whether the Cronin Consortium's recruitment interest in Caleb was still active. Vivian confirmed that it was. The implication landed without needing to be spelled out. If Hawthorne discarded, Caleb Cronin would pick him up, and the next time they sat across a negotiating table, the advantage would be permanent and irreversible. Vivian laid out her proposal without framing it as a request. Caleb Monroe would be offered a position in Hawthorne's Strategic and External Affairs Division, effective immediately, with compensation and title commensurate to the value he had demonstrated. His suspension would be rescinded and removed from all internal records. The decision would be presented to the Cronin Consortium as evidence that Hawthorne recognized and retained exceptional talent, regardless of origin, a signal of exactly the kind of institutional confidence the consortium claimed to be testing for. Vivian made it clear that this was not charity, not sentimentality, and not a publicity maneuver. It was a strategic correction of a mistake the company had been making for 3 years by letting someone of Caleb's capability empty trash cans in the dark. The vote was not unanimous, but it passed. Martin Cross abstained. The 3 board members voted in favor, not because they had changed their minds about hierarchy, but because $90 million was a number that overruled ideology. Douglas Perry was instructed to contact Caleb before noon. The call reached Caleb at 11:20 on Saturday morning. He was sitting at his kitchen counter in the studio apartment, the suspension letter still folded, where he had left it a cup of cold coffee beside it. When Douglas explained the offer, Caleb did not respond immediately. He listened to every detail, the title, the division, the salary, the full reinstatement, and then asked only one question. Does she actually want me there, or is this just to keep me away from them? Douglas, to his credit, answered honestly. Both. But she reviewed the tapes herself, and she's the one who built the case. Nobody made her do it. Caleb accepted. He put on the cleanest clothes he had took the subway 14 blocks and walked into Hawthorne Global through the main entrance for the first time in 3 years. The lobby security guard, the same one who had always waved him through the service entrance without a second glance, checked his name on the visitor list and handed him a temporary badge marked Executive Floor Access. Caleb clipped it to his shirt and took the main elevator to 47. The meeting with Vivian was brief. She was not warm. She did not congratulate him or express gratitude in any performative way. She told him what the position entailed, what would be expected, and what the timeline looked like for the resumed Cronin negotiation, now scheduled for the following Tuesday. Then she asked him something that was not in the job description. How does a janitor learn 8 languages? Caleb told her the truth, and he told it without embellishment. He had spent his 20s moving from country to country, picking up whatever work he could find. Construction in Montreal, where the crew foreman let him sleep in the supply shed and taught him French over morning coffee. Dishwashing in Berlin, where the kitchen staff shared their meals during split shifts, and Caleb absorbed German between the clatter of plates. Agricultural labor in southern Spain, learning Castilian from the other pickers in the orchards. A night watchman at a warehouse in Marseille who taught him Arabic during 12-hour shifts when neither of them had anything else to do. Russian from merchant sailors. Italian from a mechanic in a Milanese garage. Japanese from dock workers in Yokohama. Mandarin from the immigrant laborers who worked beside him at 3 different jobs across 2 continents. He supplemented everything with second-hand books, grammar guides from library discard bins, and whatever radio signals he could pick up on cheap equipment. It wasn't talent. It was not genius. It was the simple, unglamorous result of refusing to stop learning, even when no one was watching and no one cared. Vivian listened without interrupting. When he finished, she nodded once and said, "Tuesday. Be here at 8. The resumed negotiation on Tuesday went differently. Caleb sat at the table this time, not at the head, not beside Vivian, but at the table wearing a navy suit that still had the price tag crease on the sleeve. The Cronin delegation entered, and the lead representative, the tall man with silver-gray hair, saw Caleb seated among the Hawthorne team. He did not smile, but something in his expression shifted a recognition, perhaps, that the company across the table had passed a test he hadn't expected them to pass. The negotiation proceeded in plain language. The hidden clauses were renegotiated openly. The final agreement signed that afternoon was fairer than anything either side had originally proposed. In the weeks that followed, Vivian launched an internal initiative she called Talent Without Labels, a program designed to identify overlooked capabilities within Hawthorne's existing workforce from mailroom to maintenance. It was not a feel-good campaign. It was structured, metrics-driven, and tied to departmental performance reviews. The first audit uncovered a security guard with a background in data analysis, an overnight receptionist who had coded software in a previous career, and a cafeteria manager who held a lapsed degree in supply chain logistics. Vivian did not publicize the program externally. She simply built it into the way the company operated and moved on. Caleb kept his studio apartment. He kept the transistor radio on his nightstand. He kept the cardboard box of phrasebooks under his bed, though he no longer needed to hide what they represented. On his first night in the new position after everyone else had left the 47th floor, he stayed late at his desk, opened a battered notebook to a fresh page, and began studying his 9th language. No one asked him to. No one was watching. That had never been the point.